All right, we're going to go ahead and go live here. Hopefully the sound's working. Everything is good. I just need to check a few things before we get going. Hopefully it's all working. Not sure if it's streaming to Facebook yet. Should be, but okay. Not sure if it's working on Facebook, but we'll go ahead and move forward regardless in about 2 minutes. Let people kind of stream in, hopefully. Okay, cool. Yes. So I'm having trouble getting Facebook to work. Crowdcast is working, however. All right, I can't get the Facebook to work. I'm not sure what's going on with it, but we're going to go ahead and get started just because we're at 3:02 here. Hopefully people will kind of stream in as we do this. And worst case is we have a recording of some of this that hopefully will be useful for people. So just as a housekeeping thing, we are using Crowdcast. So if you are using Crowdcast, it's a little bit resource intensive. So be sure to turn off as many tabs as you can. Just try to decrease the amount of stuff going on with the computer, and it should run a little bit more smoothly. Hopefully the sound is okay. My studio literally is right outside of a boat dock that's active, so they are basically taking steel to steel and sawing pieces of metal right outside my window, but hopefully it's not too bad. So hopefully everybody can hear me and it sounds okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to Ask an Artnerd. This is the first kind of official Artnerd Live that we've been doing. We did a portfolio webinar a few weeks back that I really enjoyed doing. And I just have to say again, this is such an amazing time that I can connect with as many students that I'm able to connect with in such a way that I'm able to share information, knowledge, expertise, those kinds of things in a way that is straightforward. The downside is it feels a lot of times like I'm kind of a one-man band. You know, you see those old pictures that they've got a drum and cymbals, and you're trying to get the Facebook feed to work and it doesn't, and then the Crowdcast thing doesn't work, and then you're dealing with your Evernote and your slide presentation. And I'm hoping to get better at this as I do it more often. I really enjoy doing it. I enjoy connecting with students. So I hope that this presentation, this sort of discussion, this conversation is useful for people. You are in the right place if you are seriously interested in pursuing a professional path that involves the creation of visual stuff, regardless of medium. If you are a photographer or want to be a photographer, a painter, a designer, if you are passionate, if you are focused on the creation of meaningful things, primarily visually, but this will also relate to poets and musicians and those kinds of things as well. You are also probably facing a transition. You're interested in art school. So either you are a high school student who is trying to think of a path forward in terms of your education post high school graduation. Maybe you have graduated from an undergraduate program, maybe in art or not, and you are considering a grad school kind of program. Maybe you are in a career that you're hoping to shift to a more creative kind of visual thing and are considering, again, sort of formalized study or formalized education. And the intent of this is to help you navigate some of that area. There's a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulty, there's a lot of misinformation out there that I'm hoping to cut through and also provide some really specific kind of proactive steps you can take to make the best possible decision in terms of how you want to move forward to pursue, again, a creative life, to pursue a life where you are making things of meaning and sharing things of meaning and connecting with other creative people. So hopefully you're in the right place. Hopefully this will be useful for you. So should I go to art school? Again, it's one of those big questions that if you put it into YouTube, you get about 47 million different answers. We'll talk about why that is and talk about how you can navigate some of those things. First, just to introduce myself, my name is Jeff Tyack. I am an artist and educator. I'm the founder of Artnerd Society. And I also worked at a specialized art and design school, Pratt Institute, for about 15 years as a gatekeeper, meaning within admissions, I was one of the people who evaluated portfolios, who helped to guide students and parents, hopefully make good decisions about whether not just Pratt was a good fit, but whether this kind of focused, formalized, institutionalized kind of study path was going to be the best sort of path for them as they were trying to make decisions in terms of the professional and creative and personal sort of path for the students and as well for the parents. I come from a background of lawyers. My personal biography starts with a family where my grandfather was a lawyer and a judge. My father is a lawyer. My uncle is a lawyer and a judge. He was a Supreme Court judge, actually, in the state of Ohio for a while. He's been a judge in various other kinds of capacities. I have 3 brothers, all of who went to law school. 2 of them are practicing criminal attorneys. Most of my cousins are lawyers are in law school, same with my dad's cousins. So again, I come from a family that visual arts, visual creativity, visual expression was not something that was necessarily considered a viable kind of path. So hopefully some of you can connect with that. I went to a high school, again, had very little art and design education. We had plenty of AP classes that we could take, but very, very few of them were design focused or art focused. And this all was happening despite the fact that I was incredibly passionate about drawing, about painting, about photography, about model making, about Legos. I'd always been making visual stuff starting in about 2nd grade without a whole lot of sort of external kind of encouragement or approval. It wasn't actively discouraged, but it certainly wasn't something that was encouraged either. I come from Columbus, Ohio, where, again, in the high school I was at, the #1 priority was sports, especially as a guy. The 2nd priority was grades. 3rd priority was your 2nd sport, which was supposed to support the 1st sport. And then somewhere around 30 or 31, in terms of the priority list that was kind of put down upon us, was art, design, visual creativity. A lot of the stuff we didn't even know what it was just because we weren't exposed to it. And we really didn't have much of an opportunity to explore any of this stuff. So for me personally, as I graduated high school, art school was just not even a consideration. It's something that was not realistic or was kind of a fool's errand. And you were supposed to go to college, and essentially for me, it turned into, again, what Seth Godin calls more high school with a lot more binge drinking, which again is kind of what happened in a lot of different ways. After undergraduate, again, I worked I actually got a BFA in photography and graphic design. After 3.5 years, basically, as a junior, I decided finally to declare a major in fine arts. Again, I'd always been doing this stuff, but even in college, I hadn't taken a single art class. Decided to just kind of go with it because it was what I was drawn to. It's what I wanted to do. It's what I wanted to spend my time doing. And kind of said, screw it, and we're just going to do this. And again, I wasn't discouraged, but it wasn't actually encouraged either. The practices that I was doing, the painting, the drawing, again, was always considered a hobby in so many ways. But and went on to get my MFA eventually at Pratt Institute here in Brooklyn. And then shortly after that, I started working for Pratt and talking to students and parents about, again, that transition time. And I'm hoping, again, this presentation will be the kind of thing that I wish I had as a high school student who was really focused on this kind of stuff, but was getting terrible, terrible advice or just no advice at all. I wish it was the kind of thing that when I was looking at MFA programs, or whether I even should do an MFA program, that people had sort of helped me with as I made those decisions and committed to a very substantial kind of financial and time dedication within any of that. So that's kind of my background. That's where I'm coming from. I hope I can give you some useful advice just from personal experience, but also from professional knowledge and experience as well. So again, should I go to art school? And one thing I want to be really, really clear about, art school is not studying art. It's really, really important to differentiate that. A lot of times you start to have this conversation and you have basically two sides. You have the people that are, yes, absolutely, you must go to art school. If you want to be a graphic designer, if you want to be a painter, you absolutely must do this. And not only that, but you have to go to RISD, or you have to go to Parsons, or you have to go to Pratt. You have to go to an elite school. It has to be very focused within any of that. And to suggest that that's not necessary creates a huge kind of backlash, or creates a huge kind of defensiveness, particularly of those artists or those art educators that are very dedicated, again, to helping students out. Art school is a very specific thing, and it is not studying art. Art school, and especially as we normally talk about it when we talk about the RISDs, when we talk about the BFA programs in universities, is simply a system to deliver art education. And it is not the only one to do that. So is art school absolutely necessary? Absolutely not. Is studying art a really, really good idea? Yes. Even if you are not thinking of becoming a professional artist or a professional designer, there is fundamental value in the study of the understanding and creation of visual culture, the understanding and creation of visual language that is totally neglected, at least in the United States, in K through 12 education. There are exceptions to that, and it's not because the art teachers aren't working hard enough. It is a systemic kind of neglect that happens, so that you end up with K through 12 art teachers that are teaching 650 students a week, which is not conducive to doing any of this stuff at a level. So they're having to navigate a terrible system with very few resources, with other teachers borrowing art supplies, with other teachers basically giving them leftover house paints that then they're supposed to use with these 650 students a week. That is pretty consistent in public schools, private schools, kind of across the board, where the focus is on the wrong stuff. Studying art, studying visual culture, studying the things, creativity, design, the things that go into that is incredibly valuable. It should be prioritized just as much as studying verbal language or studying math as a language or understanding any of those kinds of things. And unfortunately, it's not. So a lot of times, even as you hit these transitions, there's a real kind of opaqueness to the conversation that goes on. And this includes both the academic kind of pursuit of art, so again, art history kind of things, the kind of standoffish studying of other people's art, but particularly in the studio practices, where the study of making stuff that takes time and effort and patience and emotional and psychological energy is mostly neglected. So studying art is always a good thing. Practicing art is always a good thing, even if you don't intend to make it your career. Art school is simply one option, and a somewhat limited and constrained option to deliver that art education. And we'll talk about why that is. At the same time, there's the other school of thought that says, well, art school is an absolute waste of time. It's way too much money. My friend went to art school and he hated it, and now he's basically works at a restaurant as a waiter, and he spent all this money, and it's a terrible, terrible idea. That could be the case for some individual friend, things like that, but it is also not true that it is always a waste of money. It is not true that formalized art education through some of these specialized schools is always a bad idea. And which brings us back to, again, should I go to art school? And the short answer, which is the useless answer, is that it depends. If you look at the YouTube videos where people talk about this, and again, it's usually artists or animation people or graphic designers talking about it, and they talk about some of the factors within that, but it's usually surface kind of factors. And again, we're going to go a little bit deeper with that, and again, give you some actionable kinds of steps you can take where you can figure out what it depends on, so that you can make as informed a decision as possible, so that you can have as clear an understanding moving forward whether this kind of decision is going to be a good fit for you. And this is the kind of thing that I talked about with students and parents all the time. And again, it was coming from a place that I worked at a specialized elite private art and design school. And I also recognize too that by the time they got to me, there was always already a huge filtering mechanism. 90% of the people that maybe could have come and seen me wouldn't, because again, art school was off the table or Pratt was too expensive, those kinds of things. So again, there's kind of an inherent bias in that, but I will talk about, again, the kind of conversation that I would encourage parents and students to have when making this decision. And it starts with, do you want to go to college? And that's a real basic kind of thing. We're not going to go into a larger conversation about the value of college in this, but the consideration of, again, specialized art college obviously falls under the umbrella of college. And there's huge issues in terms of debt burden and things like that that kind of seep into this conversation. But the first thing you need to really kind of understand is, do you want to go to college? And to be honest, is it absolutely necessary for an artist or a designer or any of those people to go to college? And the answer is no, it is not. Can it be useful? Can it be helpful? Can it help you bridge gaps in terms of skill sets, in terms of connection? Absolutely, it could. There's no guarantee of that. But in these fields, with a few exceptions, with things like architecture, it is totally viable to not go to college and to build a career in these fields. For some people, it would be easier to go to college. Some people, it wouldn't. A lot of times, again, like I said, in my own personal experience, the college was less about the classes that you took, and it was more about kind of an experience. In our country, and in the United States in particular, we do a pretty terrible job of defining that sort of transition into an adult or adulthood. And that's been true for a very long time. I think that still exists. And college can be very useful for that. But the question then becomes, is that what the intent is, and is that worth the money? Just because there's kind of a systemic or cultural failure to help students prepare for the real world, to prepare to be independent, to prepare to be autonomous, doesn't make it necessarily the best sort of pathway or system to do that. So again, generally speaking, if you're here, I'm assuming that you do want to go to college. But for those of you that don't, or that are interested in doing these other kinds of things, then understand that that can be a viable path. That's a different presentation. That's something we're going to develop at Artnerd Society in terms of alternatives to, again, formalized art education. But for now, the first decision you need to make is, do you want to go to college? So we're going to assume that that's a yes. And the next step that's really, really important to think about is, how do you want to spend your time at college? So if you're considering art school, I'm going to assume that you have an interest, at least, in, again, what I talked about, the creation of visual stuff for whatever purpose. It could be for communication purposes. It could be for commercial purposes. It could be for self-expressive purposes. It could be just to explore the world around you. Those are all incredibly valid kinds of approaches. But if you have an interest in any of that and you want to go to college, how do you want to spend your time? So the first thing you need to think about is the type of degree that you're going to pursue. And there's two main things for undergraduate. And I'm just going to talk about undergraduate because if you understand this, then you can understand two-year programs. You can also understand master's programs to a little bit of a degree, just because bachelors are going to be the most consistent among schools, among kind of opportunities for certain kinds of people. Bachelor of Arts is one, and understand the difference of this. So Bachelor of Arts, generally speaking, and it can be in any kind of discipline. You can find a Bachelor of Arts in, again, communication design, in fine arts, in studio practices, and all kinds of things. The naming of it doesn't matter as much. What matters is the fact that it is a Bachelor of Arts. And what that means is that in the curriculum, about a third of your classes are going to be studio classes, and about 2/3 are going to be general requirements. So what that means is 1/3 of your time is going to be spent actually making stuff. You will be in the studio painting, drawing, doing photography, those kinds of things. 2/3 are going to be general requirements. English classes, math classes, science classes, again, a generalized kind of educational approach that will then supplement or complement, in theory, the studio practice. There's nothing wrong with Bachelor of Arts degrees. If that's what you want to focus on, that can be a super viable path, depending on what direction you want to go. A lot of universities offer BAs and various kinds of things, as opposed to what we'll talk about next. But understand that this is very different from a BFA, which is a Bachelor of Fine Arts. And it's basically just flipped. So generally speaking, BFAs are going to be 2/3 studio classes and 1/3 general requirements. That's true whether you're at a university. It's also true if you are at a specialized art and design school. So that's the big thing. So in terms of 2-year degrees, it can vary pretty considerably. But as you look at schools, think of that balance. So for instance, I know there's Associates of Applied Science degrees out there, which are considered AAS degrees. Those usually are transfer track 2-year degrees, and the goal of those is to prepare you for the first 2 years to then transfer into a bachelor's degree. There are AOS degrees out there, which is just the studio classes. So it's a very contained, non-transferable track kind of degree, which can be a very good fit for some people. In terms of master's degrees, again, this is where you really, really need to do your research, look into the schools. It generally falls into 2 kinds of things if you're focused on studio kinds of stuff. It's going to mostly be either MFAs, which is Master of Fine Arts, or MA, which is Master of Arts. Occasionally, you might find a Master of Science degree in there, but that's going to be really particular depending on the focus of study. And again, the curriculum structure of that isn't as consistent, so you're going to have to do your research on in each individual schools. But for bachelor's degrees, as you are looking in terms of how you want to spend your time in college, the things that you want to study, the prioritizations that you want to give to your time, understand that as best you can. There is a weird thing, again, with architecture, which is there are 2 different kinds of approaches to that. There are a few BFAs in architecture out there, which is a 4-year program. It is not considered a certified or accredited kind of degree, but you can still become an architect if you do it. You just usually have to go to get a master's degree. There are also 5-year accredited Bachelor of Architecture degrees out there, which is a totally different ballgame. And again, some of the things we'll talk about will apply to some of that, but it's a little bit different sort of priority system. It's a little bit different kind of thing. And it is one of the areas that you really do probably need to get a bachelor's degree in if you want to become an architect. It's a little bit different than, say, a graphic designer, an illustrator, an animator, or working in film or working in fine art, those kinds of things. So again, be sure to do your research into that. And those are going to be much more constrained, much more structured, just because it's a very specific kind of track for you to then become a legal certified architect eventually, hopefully. So understand that. It's a really good starting point. So let's just suppose, okay, so you know you want to go to college. You know you want to study this stuff. You want to, again, focus on studio-based stuff. Even if you're not totally sure what sort of discipline focus you want, whether you want to be a photographer or a painter or any of that, try not to worry too much about that. Again, sometimes you do have to choose, but focus more on the generalized structure of it. And the next big decision then becomes whether you want to study at a specialized art and design school versus a university. So specialized art and design schools are what people traditionally think of as art schools. So RISD, Pratt, Parsons, CalArts, I think, San Francisco Art Institute, Chicago Art Institute, those kinds of places that are very specifically structured to provide types of BFA programs that are very studio focused, that create a culture and environment that is incredibly focused, again, on these disciplines. Not always the case, but universities tend to be a little bit more broad-based. So you have the opportunity to get a BFA in some of these things, but you can also study marine biology, or you can also study sociology or economics, or again, different kinds of things that are more geared towards liberal arts, that are more geared towards, again, generalized education. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I can say this, again, having experienced both, and I'll talk about, again, a little bit of my experience getting a BFA at a university. And the largest sort of challenge for most BFA programs or most BFA students in a larger university setting is simply a cultural one. In that, if you are this dedicated to becoming a painter, if you are this dedicated to doing graphic design, you are going to be in a lot of general classes with future accountants and future marketing gurus and future business people that are going to ask you on the regular, why the heck are you studying painting? What do you want to do? Go work at Starbucks? And again, it lends itself to a conversation that is idiotic, quite frankly. It's a bankrupt kind of thing. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the value of some of this stuff, whether it's in a formalized education setting or not. But so it can be a challenge to produce work or to get feedback or to be immersed in a culture that takes this stuff as seriously as you do, that appreciates this stuff, that appreciates the potential and the value of this stuff. It's the same huge disconnect that, again, a lot of people run into in high school, in that if the university is focused on sports and Ohio State football and sororities and fraternities and those kinds of things, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not being focused on visual culture and creativity and the connection and exchanges that happen between creative people that allow you to produce work and allow you to be pushed in ways that transcend, again, the formalized educational kind of structure. The end result of this is that, generally speaking, not always, but the portfolios tend to be weaker. You will be in classes because of general requirements in drawing classes and color and design classes with people that are just there to get their graduation requirement. And that dumbs down the class. Usually it makes serious art teachers incredibly frustrated because you have people that are taking this stuff seriously, you have people that are actually doing it at a relatively high level, and you have people that aren't. They're there simply to get their requirement out, or because they wanted to take it as an elective, or they thought it would be an easy A. And those of us who have been in those classes, you know who I'm talking about, and you've experienced that firsthand. Specialized art and design school, you don't have to deal with that. Everybody's there, everybody's serious for the most part. It doesn't mean that there's not a balance in terms of this stuff. It doesn't mean that there's not a diversity of approach to things. It doesn't mean that there's not opportunity to take liberal arts classes or general elective classes or to integrate other kinds of things. But for the most part, you will never, ever be asked why you're studying painting. It just is a given. The value is a given. The support is a given. The collaboration and opportunities for collaboration are substantially more diverse and more substantive. So that tends to lead to more opportunities and stronger portfolios when you graduate, stronger work when you graduate, just because that level of conversation is exponentially higher. And you have a community, hopefully, and an organization that is focused on these very specific kinds of things that you are dedicated to, that you are super serious about in terms of practicing that. So to simplify, the advice that I would generally give students that I would see is, if you know you want to do something visual, if you know you want to spend time in the studio, if you know you want to do this stuff at a high level, and that's pretty much all you want to do, no matter what, if it's graphic design or photography or film, it doesn't really matter. But if you know you just want to create stuff, and that's really your primary interest, and to explore the world and to express yourself, then specialized art and design schools can be a very, very good choice. If you are torn because, well, I really like painting, I really like graphic design, but I'm also super interested in marine biology, then specialized art and design schools are terrible, terrible choices, because you will not have the opportunity to kind of get your feet wet within any of that. Going to a university and getting a BFA does not preclude you from being successful. It does not preclude you from eventually coming to the point where you can get your work to the place that it needs to be. And even within a university setting, even if the culture is kind of against it or it's neglectful of this stuff, you can still make a lot of good stuff happen. But just understand that there is a difference, and that if you are super focused on this stuff and you are annoyed in high school because nobody really cares about art or you or your graphic design or the things that you're so focused and passionate about, again, you're an art nerd, essentially, like I was, then expect more of that if you go to a generalized university. Again, it's going to differentiate. It's going to differ depending on the place and the culture that's there, but just expect that a little bit. And the trade-off is that you'll get to experiment and have different kinds of experiences that aren't as focused on the creation of this stuff. So something to think about, something to consider as you do that. So let's suppose you are, again, this is about should I go to art school? And again, it gets confusing because what's an art school? Is it the BFA program in the university? Is it just specialized art and design school? Is it a 2-year program? Is it a seminar class? And the answer is yes, but it's all of those things. But we're going to assume that, again, you're talking about RISD or you're talking about some of these specialized art and design schools. This stuff that I'm going to talk about next is also applicable to BFAs and universities, though. And I'm going to give you some things to think about, some things to talk about, some things to consider that, okay, so you decide, yeah, I absolutely want to do this. I'm going to college. I want to focus on what I want to focus on. I want to spend my time in the studio. I want to make meaningful stuff. I want to be surrounded in an environment that is focused on that kind of thing. So what are the things that I really need to consider as I look at that? And some of this will overlap a little bit with general college search, but in my experience as a gatekeeper, in my experience, again, personal experience going through these stages, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things and some of the mistakes that people make within that. So as you're going through this process, there's a lot more than 3, but I want to talk about the big 3. The 3 things that absolutely do not matter, the things that people put way too much weight in, the considerations that they waste their time with. And the first one is, rankings. Rankings are useless. It doesn't matter if it's US News and World Report. It doesn't matter if it's Design Intelligence. Rankings don't mean anything because you are looking for a good fit for you. There is no such thing as a best art school. There is no such thing as a best design school, despite the bad articles out there that list the 5 things, because you need to find the best school for you. And unless US and World News Report called you on the phone and asked extensively what you needed and what your specific circumstances were, the fact that they ranked one school as a 1 and one school as a 2 and one school as a 3 means absolutely nothing to you. The prestige of that is bogus and false. It doesn't mean anything. And unfortunately, this whole focus on rankings, and this is true in general college, has really warped a lot of things and created all kinds of opportunities for bad behavior as people struggle to sort of get their rankings up, which is a monetary consideration that is, again, a system that is geared towards focusing on students' fear of missing out. And the implication is that if I got into the 3rd ranked art school and not the 1st, that somehow I'm lesser than the students that got into the 1st. That is garbage. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. It is totally useless. Don't worry about rankings. Don't worry about any of that. What you should be looking for is a place, an environment, a curriculum, a path where you're going to make the best work you can, where you're going to be stimulated, where you're going to create stuff that has value to yourself and to others and allow you to connect in a serious way to other artists, but also other people in general. And the rankings do nothing for that. That's a huge conversation. Well, we can have more of that at Artnerd Society, but I'll leave that at that. Acceptance rate. And this basically is somewhat similar to the rankings aspect of it. If a school has a 3% acceptance rate, it does not mean it's a better school. And it certainly doesn't mean it's a better school for you. This is one of those areas that students get obsessed about because they're terrified that they're going to miss out. They're terrified that if I don't get into this school, I'm going to be a failure. I'm never going to be the artist. I'm never going to have an opportunity to do this. The perfect acceptance rate is 100%. And what I mean by that is if schools were doing a perfect job of enrolling the students that they wanted, of enrolling students that were the best possible fit, they would have, suppose they needed 100 students. They would get 100 applications, all of whom would be qualified. They would accept all 100, and all 100 of those students would come. It would be that would be considered a 100% acceptance rate. And if that was possible, schools would do that. Unfortunately, it's not. So if they have to say they need 500 students for the freshman class, and they know that only half of the students that they accept are going to come, then they need to accept 1,000 students. Sometimes they'll get a little bit more than 500, sometimes they'll get a little bit less. Again, consistency over the years in terms of the internal statistics of that and enrollment planning and those kinds of things. They basically have to do a guessing game of who's going to come, who's going to be accepted. And then again, if they can't accept everybody, then they need to create criteria, many times, which is somewhat arbitrary. But the thing you have to understand is that every school accepts students in a different way, and it is totally opaque. There are schools that look at each application with a fine-tooth comb, and they look at your essay, and they look at your SAT, and they look at your grades, and they look at the number of AP classes, and you have to do an interview, and you have to do a home test, and you have to do a portfolio, and they gather all this information that is supposed to signify your potential in theory, and they sit down with faculty and chairs and alumni, and they get into fistfights basically about who's going to come to their school. There are also schools, and I can speak about this with Pratt, where the decision committee is essentially one person looking at an Excel sheet with 3 factors, which was SAT, GPA, and portfolio. There are schools that are kind of in between that. You have absolutely no control over acceptance procedure or acceptance processes. And there is no standardization within any of that, despite the Common App, despite all of that stuff. Different schools handle it very different. You do not have control over that. For art schools, if you submit a portfolio, which you more than likely will, there will be schools that have entire faculty committees look at it. And they'll look at it multiple times, and they'll take an average of scores, and they'll score it certain kinds of ways. At Pratt, we basically had one person look at a portfolio. So you would basically look, we had 5,000 applications. There were 5 admissions counselors or admissions officers. We'd each look at 1,000 portfolios and then evaluate that. So do not worry about acceptance rate. Just because a school is more competitive than another one doesn't mean it's better. It also doesn't mean that it's better for you, more importantly. So ignore it. Ignore acceptance rate. Don't hesitate to apply to a place that you think you might not get in because of the acceptance rate. Because again, you have no idea about their process internally. So. And the final thing, there's so many things with this, but this is just one that always annoyed the heck out of me. Very, very common marketing tactic. And it's a reaction to the expense of college, and this is not limited to art and design schools, is that they talk about their job placement rate and their graduate salaries. Ignore that. It doesn't mean anything. It's something that they do. They survey alumni. Again, different schools are going to do it differently, but who knows who writes back. Again, it's a very self-reported kind of thing. And that's irrelevant. Even if they did a perfect survey, these fields that we're talking about, whether it's design or illustration or animation or film or photography or painting or printmaking, any of these creative fields, no one knows what the job prospects are going to be like in 5 years. No one does. If they're telling you that, they're lying to you, period. Just as a personal experience. So my background is in photography. This is going back to the 90s again. Internet was just coming around. I graduated in 1996. I think we got email in 95 and nobody knew what to do with it. Things started to take off. This is before digital photography really took off. And the focus of when I started college in 1991, if I was looking at graduate salaries and job placement for photographers, by 1996, even back then, it was irrelevant. And the bulk of my college education was focused on black and white traditional photography. I became almost a master in printing and developing my own film and doing black and white prints and everything from 4x5s to medium format to 35 millimeter to alternative processes. There was a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of skill sets that I developed over those 4 or 5 years. And by 1997, most of that was useless. this has only increased exponentially since then. So just as a secondary kind of part of that, one of the first jobs I got out of college actually was working as a photojournalist for Reuters. And it was just, this talks about how quickly this transition is happening. And again, this is the mid-90s. So 1996, the Olympic Games going on, working for Reuters, very cool. They paid for me to basically go work at the Olympics. I didn't get to see any of it, but I got to develop film and those kinds of things. And at that point, Reuters and AP, again, two big sort of wire services. And for the Olympics, literally that summer, AP and Reuters were, the photographers would go take the pictures at the sporting events. They'd bring it back to us. We would develop the film. Film would then get scanned even then, but there was a secondary process with that. And then it would get sent over the wire, get sent onto the internet basically at that point. Whole process, again, including delivering film canisters and developing the film, probably took anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes. It was our job to be as quick as possible because especially in that field, the first pictures are the ones that get published. The first pictures are the ones the newspapers picked up. That's how these agencies get paid. So being first was very, very, very important. Following fall, the 1996 presidential inaugurations, basically. So for Republican and Democratic, we showed up at Reuters and we were still doing film-based photography. So we literally, they had the big floor, again, the stage, everything. And so we had runners who would pick up the film from the photographers. They'd bring it back to us in a trailer. We'd deliver it and then print it. And the editors would go through it and the editors would send it over the wire and hopefully they would get picked up. Again, about the same amount of turnaround, 15, 16 minutes on a roll of film. AP, I think for the first time ever, switched to digital. So instead of developing film, their runners were using memory cards. And they had a turnaround that was probably about 5 minutes at the most. And they crushed us. And the difference between that and it was just such a huge sort of crossing the line in terms of the technology. And again, this is mid-90s. This isn't recent stuff. Was huge. So you can imagine my sort of looking at this as someone who just got their BFA that was very focused on film photography going, oh God, now what am I going to do? And then proceeded to keep struggling basically with any of that. But so what's my point? My point is that don't believe the graduate salaries, don't believe any of that. If you are interested in that kind of stuff, don't ask the schools for it. Get on LinkedIn, ask professionals, ask people to share their experiences in terms of if they're willing to share it, salary levels, those kinds of things. Find third-party kinds of places because the job placement graduate salary aspect is usually inflated for marketing purposes, but more importantly, you don't know what it's going to look like in 4 to 5 years, especially in these fields. So if we're ignoring those things, which I do recommend as you're looking at schools, let's talk about what really does matter. Curriculum. Surprisingly neglected by students as they look at college. We touched on it a little bit in terms of BFA versus BA, but also look at what courses the actual school offers. Hugely important. Do they have a foundation year? Is it very specific? Do they have, again, with film, there are some film programs that track you directly into very specific kinds of things. So you start right away being tracked to be a director or to be a cinematographer. There are more generalist kinds of approaches, and they don't jive well with each other. The person that is going to love that tracked kind of program to be a director is going to hate a generalist program. The person who wants to be a generalist, who wants to do the independent film, who wants to do everything themselves and get their feet wet, is going to hate a tracked program. So look at the curriculum. It is on the school's websites. It is usually in the academic programs. Take a look at it as you do your research. So again, as you're looking at schools, look at that curriculum in as much minutia as you possibly can. project yourself forward in 2 or 3 years down the road and think about, well, what classes will I actually be waking up for at 8 o'clock in the morning and spending 6 hours at on a Tuesday? Think about that because it matters. The other big thing which I would warn you about is, especially within an art and design context, doesn't matter if it's a university or specialized art and design school, is stay away from specific technical skills classes. It doesn't mean you shouldn't take some of it, but do not avoid classes that are like, you're just going to learn how to do Photoshop, or you're just going to learn how to use a red camera, or you're just going to learn how to do this very specific thing in photography, maybe just doing 4x5. Again, skills training can have its place, but it is the easiest to find on your own. It is the easiest to train on your own. And look for curriculum, look for courses that integrate that technology, that integrate those skills in more meaningful, more substantive kinds of ways. So that can take all kinds of forms, but just be very, very aware of programs and of curriculums where you're like 75 to 80% of them seem to be learning computer programs or learning how to use certain specific technology, because again, that is going to change very, very quickly. My personal skill set developing black and white film became very useless very quickly. Adobe products shift all the time very quickly. So those are things you're going to have to pick up. They're things you're going to have to learn, but they're the easiest to learn. It is the most available online at this point, either for free or for very inexpensive, an inexpensive price. So beware of curriculums that, again, focus too much on that. Doesn't mean you can't have some, but try to have 90–95% of it be more substantive than that. And if it's not clear, ask the school, contact the teacher that teaches it, and get a sense of things as much as possible. You owe it to yourself to not get trapped into these sort of requirements that long-term will seem like a huge waste of money, because they usually are. Tied to curriculum is faculty. Do your research on the faculty, understand who they are, understand the kind of work that they produce, understand who you're actually going to be connecting with, who you're actually going to be learning from. It's something that usually gets totally neglected as well. You should be able to find faculty on the website, and you should be able to find those faculty's portfolios either through the school or in an external site of theirs. So understand what they're focused on, what kind of work they do, the kind of stuff that they are interested in. And if you connect with that, then that's a good thing. If you do your research into the faculty and it just seems totally outdated or totally useless or just isn't the kind of stuff that you're interested in, even if it's in the same domain, the same field, that's a huge red flag in terms of what to avoid. Just to go back to, I'm going to show you a little bit of examples here. So here's Parsons' faculty list. Just to give you a sense of difference, and again, this speaks a little bit to the university versus specialized art and design school. So I went to Miami University, had a very good experience. It's a very good state school in Ohio. It's big. It's has a lot of very good, very dedicated people. And I had access to one photography teacher at the time. Very nice guy, very good at what he did, but he did a very specific kind of work. I had no other options. I think we had a visiting instructor once that was a commercial photographer, but it didn't jive with the schedule. So I had access to one professor, to one approach, to one kind of skill set. And I loved his class. I really did. And I learned a lot. But it was an incredibly isolated kind of experience. Just as a sense of contrast, this is Parsons, again, a specialized art and design school, photography BFA program. Again, essentially a smaller school than Miami, but it's focused on this stuff. It has a diversity of approaches, it has a diversity of classes, it has a diversity of work that will affect the stuff that you eventually produce. It will affect the sophistication of the things that you produce. And this is by no means a commercial for Parsons, but it just gives you a sense. This is going to be mostly true with all kinds of schools, but just be sure to look at that faculty. be sure to do your research in terms of any of that. And finally, cost. And this is a huge one. This is something that you could just teach classes on, but I want to give you a few basic things to think about, a few basic things to consider. One of the largest disadvantages of specialized art design schools is that they are private. I believe the tuition for Pratt this year for 17-18 is $50,000 a year. RISD is probably a little bit above that. Other schools are probably very similar. There are specialized art and design schools that are not as expensive, but for the most part, ACAD schools, which is the accreditation agency for a lot of these specialized art and design schools, a vast majority of them are going to be private, which means that they are going to be outrageously expensive with fees and living expenses, those kinds of things. The sticker price, again, is about $70,000, $75,000, depending. That is outrageous for any kind of degree. This goes with any college, but I think it applies especially to our design colleges. And this is what causes a lot of resentment, I think, among alumni and among people in the field, is that you do not want to graduate with a lot of debt. And a lot of debt can be, different kinds of things, but most of these fields, film, photography, communication design, graphic design, illustration, animation, computer graphics, video game design, painting, any of this stuff. When you graduate, you will be a freelancer, almost guaranteed. There are jobs out there, but they are few and far between that are more stable. But if you are focused on making a living producing stuff, more than likely you will be a freelancer. Freelancing is fantastic where it can be because you have a lot of autonomy. You can actually end up making more money than if you work at a firm or if you work at a large corporation or work at a large company. But it is very, very difficult to get started. It is a challenge to get started. It is a huge transition, especially after you graduate. And your student loans will come due 6 months after you graduate. You can defer them. I forget what the rules are now, but it used to be you could defer them for 6 months at a time, but you can only do that like 4 times. And from personal experience, this has to do with my master's degree, but I graduated with about $80,000 in debt, which was crippling. I started to freelance. I tried to freelance. I at the beginning of what would have been a very successful freelance photography business, and that 6 month point hit, and it was $600, $700 a month, and it put my business under, period. So I had to go find another job. I had to find a job that had a more stable income, but then also try to make ends meet in other kinds of ways, while still kind of going through debt, not just because of student loans, but just because it contributed to that whole thing. So if it's not the actual cost, if it's not actually $70,000 a year, how do you figure out how much it is? And let me give you a little bit of warning too. There are times when admissions people or faculty, and I've seen this a lot, I never gave this or tried not to give this advice, where they'll just like, oh, don't worry about it. Just apply and see what happens and see what your financial aid package. I see that as almost unethical advice because the idea behind that is that if you get accepted, no matter what the cost, you're going to be hesitant to not take advantage of that. And you're going to feel very, very bad if you get accepted to your dream school and then have to make a decision where you just can't afford it, or it wouldn't be smart to pay the money for that. So avoid that advice as much as possible. Be as informed as you can be in terms of potential costs of this stuff. And I will, for those of you who registered for the course, or again, I'll put this on Artnerd Society as well. I just want to share a really amazing resource with you. It's on New York Times. And what this is it basically is a very, very nice infographic about possible scenarios in terms of what you could owe. And it even has school-specific kinds of data. So for instance, I'll use Pratt as an example since I just came from there. Pratt Institute, Maine. So the average student debt at this college, according to this, is $35,678. It could be more, it could be less, depending on what's going on. This is for undergraduate. So if you're limiting that to 20% of your discretionary income, then you would need to make $40,000, almost $41,000 in order to pay that. That's the absolute minimum. That means you're not saving other money. That also means you're probably not living in a big city. In New York, it's another issue because rent is it's anywhere from 35 to 50% of your discretionary income. So I'll post this again on Artnerd Society, but also on the Crowdcast site. But take a look at this. If you want to delve deeper, and I do recommend this, is if you go to the Department of Education profile, and I'll send this link out as well, is the NCES National Statistics Navigator. You can search by school and actually do comparisons with schools with this. Hugely useful resource. It's a little less user-friendly, but so things like net price, really important. So again, this is after grants, after scholarship, after all those kinds of things, which is different than tuition, again, which is what they will call the sticker price, essentially. But there's a lot of really useful information with this. Admissions, you can find out, again, diversity stuff, you can find out SAT scores. Again, don't worry about acceptance rates. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. So, great. So like I said, take costs into consideration. Do not go into too much debt for any of this. It's unfortunate that the millennials, and actually I'll just consider I'm Generation X, but the same kind of phenomena, that the opportunities outside of formalized institutional corporate education are as limited as they are right now. Excuse me. I believe this is going to change, but it hasn't gotten there yet. It's starting to change, and especially in these fields. And I think that art design schools and those that are interested in, again, these fields overall actually have an opportunity to lead what will essentially become a revolution in higher education in terms of breaking down the 4-year thing. Again, who says you can only study for 4 years? As creatives, you will be expected to be learning the rest of your career, the rest of your lives. You'll be adjusting, you'll be navigating, you will have 14, 15 different careers, essentially. That's already started. Most of those will be based off of gig economy kinds of things where you'll be jumping around, again, which can be amazing if you do it well. But it's also very terrifying because through high school and through college, we were trained essentially to navigate a system that was designed in the late 19th and early 20th century that is increasingly irrelevant. And colleges are still based on that, and that includes specialized art and design schools. So it's something that will change, something that hopefully will change, but it's not quite there yet, but hopefully we can continue to make that happen anyway. So just one final thing, and this is a sort of hypocritical thing because I'm going to give advice about not giving advice, is that as you approach this, as you figure out, again, what should I go to art school? It depends. What does it depend on for me? I really want to encourage you to ask for experiences, not advice. There's a lot of advice out there, and you could probably include this whole presentation as it. It's good to listen to it, but take everything with a grain of salt. And if you're asking, if you're trying to figure stuff out, ask for experiences. Don't ask, should I go to art school? And 47 other people have 47 opinions on it, none of which are really relevant to what you're doing. It is always ultimately going to be your decision. And if you're working with your parents, which a lot of you will be, and if you're looking at undergraduate programs, it's going to be a collaboration between you and your parents to sort of choose and support a path that hopefully will lend itself to designing and creating a creative life and a creative experience and a creative professional path for yourself. The best thing you can do is to ask for other people's experiences, whether it's about a specific art school, whether it's about a career path, and do not limit it to people that are in school. So if you are super interested in graphic design, find graphic designers. It's not that hard. Go onto LinkedIn, go onto YouTube, find communities of like-minded people, and don't ask for advice, ask for their experience. And get as much and as diverse an amount of experience as you possibly can. And then it's up to you to evaluate those experiences to determine whether it's relevant to you, and then make the best possible decision you can. And it changes everything. So if you have connection with a faculty member, if you email a faculty member, ask them about their experience with any of that. If you have a designer that you love or someone that you saw on the internet that's making amazing work, try to connect with them and ask them what their experience was, whether they went to art design school. If they did, what was it like? What would they, again, what was their experience like when they did it? Did it affect their work? How did it affect their work? Ask good questions. Ask for how they did things and what those experiences were like. And it will serve you much, much better than asking for an opinion, than asking for advice that may or may not jive with your priorities, or that may or may not sort of coincide with your values in various kinds of ways. So in order to do that, again, I just want to take a second to invite anybody who's watching this to artnerdsociety.com. It is a place where we can continue this conversation. Again, we just kind of touched on basics. It's a lot of big stuff to sort of consider, a lot of big stuff to talk about. But this community, this digital community that we've designed, is entire intent is to create a gravitational point, again, of like-minded creative people at various levels of their careers, of their experiences, that can exchange ideas, that can collaborate, that can exchange experiences. And I want to invite anybody who's watching this to join. It is free. It is a very nice opportunity to connect with other people that either are going through similar challenges that you're going through or have already gone through them. So it is a great place to ask for experiences, which then can hopefully help you navigate, hopefully help you make more informed decisions about how you want to approach this stuff, how you want to approach your creativity, your career, the way that you want to educate yourself, how you want to allocate resources in order to do that. And it's also a lot of fun too. So I definitely hope you'll come join us and contribute and engage. And as always, I am on there a lot. So if you have any questions about what I just talked about art schools, about gatekeeping, about career choices, about the creative economy, about how education is going to basically either explode or hopefully evolve probably in the next 10 to 15 years. I love having those kinds of discussions. So I hope you'll join us at Artnerd Society and ask as many questions as you can possibly think of. So thanks for watching. Thanks for joining. And we'll hopefully see you next time. What did I just do?